The story doesn't begin with kings or empires or even cities. It begins far earlier, in a time so distant that even memory itself has no shape there, when a land we now call India was not a country or a civilization, but a vast and untamed world of forests, rivers, mountains, and monsoon skies. And long before any written word, before temples, before kingdoms, before history had a voice, there were people moving through this land, people we now call the Adivasi, the original inhabitants, the first known humans to call the Indian subcontinent home. And they were not building cities or carving monuments. They were living in rhythm with the land itself, moving with the seasons, hunting, gathering, surviving, adapting, and for tens of thousands of years, possibly as far back as 30,000 years ago, or even more, they existed in ways that left almost no trace behind except fragments of tools, faint markings, and stories that would only survive much later, through oral traditions passed down, across generations, whispers of a time when humanity itself was still learning how to exist in the world. These Adivasi groups were not one single people, but many tribes scattered across forests, hills, and plains, each with their own customs, their own languages, their own beliefs tied deeply to nature, to rivers, to animals, to spirits unseen. And unlike later civilizations, they did not leave behind grand ruins or written records, which means that much of their story is forever hidden from us, locked away in time. And yet they are the true beginning, the foundation upon which everything else in. This story will rise. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something changed. Human beings began to settle. Instead of constantly moving, they started staying in one place, experimenting with agriculture, learning how to grow crops, how to domesticate animals, how to build more permanent shelters. And over centuries, this shift would transform everything. Because once humans settled, they began to build, and once they built, they began to organize, and once they organized, civilization was born. And out of this transformation, along the banks of one of the great rivers of the world, the Indus River, something extraordinary emerged. 5. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the earliest and most advanced urban civilizations in human history, began to take shape around the late 4th millennium BC, at a time when other great civilizations were rising in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. And yet this civilization, spread across what is now modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, would grow into something vast, something incredibly sophisticated, and something that even today remains deeply mysterious. At its height, around 2600 BC, the Indus Valley Civilization was home to perhaps 5 million people, living across hundreds of cities and towns. And among these, two names stand out, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, cities that were not just settlements but masterpieces of planning and engineering, places where streets were laid out in perfect grids, where buildings were constructed with uniform-baked bricks, where entire urban layouts were designed with a level of precision that would not be seen, again, in many parts of the world for centuries. Imagine walking through one of these cities at its peak, wide streets stretching in straight lines, houses with multiple rooms, wells providing water, and beneath your feet, something almost unbelievable for its time, a complex drainage and sewage system, carefully designed to carry waste away from homes, a level of sanitation that would not be matched in many other civilizations for over 1,000 years. And then there was the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a massive, carefully constructed pool, likely used for ritual or religious purposes, suggesting that these people were not only concerned with survival and trade, but also with spiritual life, with ritual, with meaning. Trade was everywhere. The people of the Indus Valley were not isolated. They were connected, trading goods across vast distances, with evidence showing links to Mesopotamia, using seals and symbols to mark goods, to identify merchants, to organize commerce. And these seals, small carved objects often depicting animals or figures, remain one of the most fascinating remnants of their world. Because on these seals and on various artifacts is a script that no one has been able to fully decipher. And that is one of the greatest mysteries in all of ancient history. We have their cities, their tools, their art, their trade networks, their infrastructure, but we do not have their voices. We cannot read their stories. We do not know their names. We do not know their rulers. We do not know their myths. And because of this, the Indus Valley Civilization feels almost like a ghost, incredibly advanced, incredibly real, and yet silent. From burial sites, we can tell that they believed in some form of afterlife, as people were buried with goods, suggesting a belief that something continued beyond death. And differences in graves hint at social hierarchy, wealth differences, perhaps early class structures, but nothing as rigid or clearly defined as what would come later. And then, after nearly 2,000 years of thriving, something began to go wrong. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic collapse, but slowly, quietly, over generations. Around 1900 BC, the great cities began to decline. The streets emptied. The buildings fell into disrepair. The systems that once worked so perfectly began to fail. And the reasons for this are still debated, but the most widely accepted explanation points to something beyond human control: climate. The region began to grow cooler and drier. The monsoon pattern shifted, and without reliable rains, agriculture suffered, crops failed, food became scarce, and without food, cities cannot survive. At the same time, geological changes, possibly earthquakes, caused the Indus River to shift its course, moving away from some of the major cities, cutting them off from their lifeline, their water source. And so, slowly, people began to leave. Not all at once, not in panic, but gradually, families moving away, communities dispersing, cities shrinking until they were no longer cities at all. But the people did not disappear. They moved, most likely migrating southeast, deeper into the Indian subcontinent, carrying with them their knowledge, their traditions, their genes, becoming part of the populations that would shape the future of India. Some scholars believe that these migrants may have contributed to the origins of the Dravidian language family, languages like Tamil and Telugu that are still spoken today by millions. And so the Indus Valley Civilization did not end in fire or conquest. It faded like a tide going out, leaving behind ruins, mysteries, and questions that still echo thousands of years later. And as those cities faded into silence, a new chapter was already beginning. New people arriving, new ideas forming, new cultures taking root, and the story of India was about to change in ways that would shape its identity forever. As the great cities of the Indus Valley slowly emptied and their bricks began to crumble under the weight of time, the land they left behind did not remain empty for long, because history never allows a vacuum to exist for too long. And into this changing landscape came new people, new voices, new traditions that would reshape the identity of the subcontinent in ways that are still visible today. And these people are known as the Vedic peoples or the Indo-Aryans, and their arrival marks one of the most important turning points in the history of India. They did not arrive as a massive, organized invasion sweeping across the land in a single moment, but rather as waves of migration, slow and gradual, beginning around 1500 BC, coming from regions of Central Asia, moving through mountain passes into the northwestern parts of the Indian subcontinent, bringing with them a way of life that was very different from the urban culture of the Indus Valley. Because these were not city builders, not at first. They were pastoralists, semi-nomadic people who lived with their herds, who valued mobility, who measured wealth not in bricks and buildings, but in cattle, in horses, in the strength of their tribes and the courage of their warriors. 7. One of the most important things they brought with them was the horse, an animal that would transform warfare, travel, and culture across the subcontinent, because before this, horses were not widely used in India, and with horses came chariots, fast, mobile, powerful machines of war that gave these new arrivals a significant advantage in battle and movement. And it wasn't just about military power. It was about identity, because the horse became deeply embedded in their rituals, their myths, their sense of prestige. But even more important than horses or chariots was something less visible, something far more powerful: language. They brought with them an early form of Sanskrit, known as Vedic Sanskrit, a language that would become the foundation of countless texts, philosophies, and traditions, a language that would shape not only India, but much of South and Southeast Asia for thousands of years. And through this language, they gave us something extraordinary. The Vedas. 6. The Vedas are not just texts. They are among the oldest sacred writings in human history, composed around 1500 BC and passed down orally for generations before ever being written, memorized with astonishing precision, recited, preserved, protected, and they form the very foundation of Indian spiritual and philosophical thought. There are 4 main Vedas: the Rig Veda, the oldest and most important, filled with hymns dedicated to gods, forces of nature, cosmic principles. Then the Yajurveda, focused on rituals and sacrifices, the Samaveda, which turned many of the Rig Veda's hymns into musical chants, and the Atharva Veda, which included spells, incantations, and reflections on daily life. These texts were not written casually. They were sacred, powerful, believed to hold truths about the universe itself, about the nature of existence, about the relationship between humans and the divine, and those who studied and preserved them held immense respect in society. At first, Vedic society was simple, tribal, organized around clans and kinship groups, led by chiefs or kings who were often warriors, and these tribes moved, settled temporarily, moved again, living between the Punjab region and the northwestern plains. But over time, something began to shift again. They started settling, not in massive cities like the Indus Valley, but in villages, small agricultural communities, especially as they moved eastward, crossing rivers like the Ganges and Yamuna, entering fertile lands that could support farming. And this transition from nomadic life to settled agriculture changed everything. Because once people settle, they begin to create structure, hierarchy, systems of organization. And from this transformation emerged one of the most defining and controversial systems in Indian history, the Varna system. 6. Originally, Vedic society had a simple division, mostly between warriors and non-warriors. But as society grew more complex, this evolved into a structured hierarchy described in the Rig Veda, particularly in a hymn known as the Purusha Sukta, which symbolically describes society as emerging from the body of a cosmic being. From the head came the Brahmins, the priestly class, those responsible for studying, teaching, and performing rituals, guardians of sacred knowledge, highly respected, often placed at the top of the social order. From the arms came the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers, kings, nobles, those who wielded power, who fought wars, who protected and governed society. From the thighs came the Vaishyas, the common people in terms of economic activity, farmers, merchants, traders, those who sustained the economy, who produced wealth. And from the feet came the Shudras, the laborers, the workers, those who served the other classes, forming the foundation upon which everything else stood. At this early stage, the system was more flexible than it would later become, but the seeds were planted, and over centuries, this structure would harden into the caste system, shaping social interactions, opportunities, identities, and inequalities in profound ways. But Vedic life was not only about hierarchy and structure, it was also deeply spiritual, deeply connected to ritual, to fire ceremonies known as yajnas, where offerings were made to gods like Indra, Agni, Varuna, seeking rain, victory, prosperity, balance in the universe. Because to the Vedic people, the world was not random. It was ordered, governed by cosmic laws. And humans had a role to play in maintaining that order. At the same time, their society was not peaceful in the modern sense. It was filled with conflict, tribes competing for land, for resources, for dominance, engaging in warfare, raids, alliances, and rivalries. And 2 of the most prominent tribes mentioned in the text are the Purus and the Bharatas, groups whose conflicts and stories would echo through later traditions. And then came another major shift: iron. Around 1200 BC, the use of iron tools and weapons began to spread across the subcontinent, and this changed everything again, because iron tools allowed people to clear dense forests more effectively, to expand agriculture, to settle more permanently, to build larger communities, and as settlements grew, so did complexity. Villages became towns. Towns became centers of power, and slowly, over centuries, the world of the Vedic peoples moved further away from its nomadic roots and closer to something that resembled organized civilization. But while this transformation was happening in the north, in other parts of the subcontinent, especially in the Deccan Plateau and the south, different cultures were developing, some of which we know only through archaeological remains, like the Jorwe culture in present-day Maharashtra, a society that lasted for centuries and left behind strange and puzzling evidence, such as burial practices where bodies were found with feet removed and artifacts depicting headless figures, mysteries that still have no clear explanation. All of these cultures, known and unknown, visible and invisible, were part of a larger, complex tapestry, a subcontinent filled with diversity, with different ways of life, different beliefs, different systems, all evolving at the same time. And as centuries passed, the Vedic period itself began to change, not ending suddenly, but transforming, giving rise to something new, something more complex, something that would bring back cities, but this time not like the silent cities of the Indus Valley, but vibrant centers of power, politics, philosophy, and religion. Because around 700 to 600 BC, a new era was beginning. Cities were rising again. Kingdoms were forming. Ideas were exploding. And the stage was being set for one of the most revolutionary periods in human history. A time when new religions would be born, new philosophies would challenge old traditions, and India would once again transform itself in ways that would echo across the world. As the Vedic world continued to evolve, slowly shifting from scattered tribes and pastoral life into more settled agricultural communities, something profound began to take shape across the northern plains of the Indian subcontinent, especially along the fertile regions of the Ganges River, where dense forests were being cleared with iron tools and new settlements were expanding into lands that had once been nearly impenetrable. And as these settlements grew, they began to transform into something that had not been seen in India since the days of the Indus Valley cities, not identical to those ancient ones, but alive in a very different way, louder, more dynamic, filled with trade, politics, and ideas constantly colliding and reshaping one another. These cities became the centers of new political structures known as Janapadas, which were essentially territorial states or kingdoms built around a central town or city. And over time, as power consolidated and rivalries intensified, some of these Janapadas expanded into larger and more powerful entities known as Mahajanapadas, literally meaning great realms. And by around the 6th century BC, there were 16 of these major powers competing across northern India, each with its own rulers, armies, alliances, and ambitions, shaping a landscape that was far more politically complex than anything that had existed before in the region. Among these, regions like Kuru, Vats, Kosala, and especially Magadha began to stand out, not just because of military strength, but because of geography, resources, and strategic positioning, and Magadha in particular would become one of the most important centers in all of Indian history. Located in what is now Bihar, benefiting from fertile land ideal for rice cultivation, access to rivers for trade and transport, and crucially, deposits of iron that could be used to forge tools and weapons, giving it a powerful economic and military advantage over its rivals. But while kings and kingdoms were rising, something even more powerful was happening beneath the surface of society, something that had nothing to do with armies or conquest, and everything to do with thought, with philosophy, with the deepest questions humans can ask, because this period, often called the Second Urbanization, was not just about cities returning, it was about ideas exploding, about people beginning to question the old Vedic traditions, the rituals, the authority of priests, the meaning of life, suffering, death, and what, if anything, lay beyond it. And out of this intellectual and spiritual awakening emerged two of the most influential religious traditions in human history. The first of these was Jainism, a path that rejected violence in its most absolute form. And its story is closely tied to a man named Mahavira, who is considered the 24th Tirthankara, or spiritual teacher, in the Jain tradition. Although Jains believe that their religion is eternal, existing across infinite cycles of time, with many such teachers appearing again and again. Mahavira was born into a royal family, a prince who had access to comfort, wealth, and power, But like many great spiritual figures in history, he chose to walk away from all of it at the age of 30, leaving behind his home, his status, his possessions, to pursue a life of extreme asceticism, seeking truth not in luxury, but in renunciation, in discipline, in total detachment from worldly desires. For 12 long years, he wandered, meditated, endured hardship, pushing his body and mind to their limits, until he achieved what is known in Jainism as Kevala Jnana, a state of absolute knowledge and enlightenment, a complete understanding of the universe and the soul's place within it. And from that moment on, he became a teacher, gathering followers, spreading his message, building a community that would carry his teachings forward long after his death. At the heart of Jainism are 5 core principles, vows that its followers strive to live by: truth, non-stealing, celibacy or chastity, non-possessiveness, and most importantly, ahimsa, non-violence, not just toward humans, but toward all living beings, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant they might seem. And this idea of absolute non-violence will become one of the most powerful moral philosophies to emerge from India, influencing not just religion, but politics, culture, and even modern figures thousands of years later. But Jainism was not alone. Around the same time, another figure emerged whose story would resonate across continents, whose teachings would shape entire civilizations, and whose influence would extend far beyond the borders of India. That figure was Gautama Buddha. Born as Siddhartha Gautama, he too was a prince, raised in luxury, shielded from the harsh realities of life, living in a palace where suffering, illness, and death were kept hidden from him, as if by avoiding them, they could somehow be erased. But reality has a way of breaking through even the strongest illusions. One day, he ventured outside the palace walls and encountered something that would change him forever. He saw an old man, frail, weak, bent by time, and for the first time, he realized that aging was inevitable, that no one could escape it. Then he saw a sick man, suffering from disease, and understood that the body is fragile, vulnerable to pain. Then he saw a corpse, lifeless, and came face to face with death itself. And finally, he saw a wandering ascetic, a man who had chosen a life of simplicity and spiritual pursuit. And in that moment, Siddhartha understood that there might be a way to confront suffering, not by ignoring it, but by understanding it. And so, like Mahavira, he left everything behind. He abandoned his palace, his wealth, his family, and began a journey in search of truth, experimenting with extreme asceticism, pushing himself to the brink of death, believing that denying the body might lead to enlightenment. But eventually he realized that this path was not the answer, that neither indulgence nor extreme deprivation could bring true understanding. And so he chose what he called the middle path. He sat beneath a tree, now known as the Bodhi tree, in a place called Bodh Gaya, and meditated deeply, refusing to rise until he had found the answers he sought. And after 49 days of meditation, he achieved enlightenment, becoming the Buddha, the awakened one. What he discovered was both simple and profound. Life is suffering. Suffering has a cause, which is desire. Suffering can end, and there's a path to end it. These are known as the Four Noble Truths, and alongside them, he taught the Eightfold Path, a guide for living a life of wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline, including right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Unlike the rigid rituals of the Vedic tradition, Buddhism offered something more accessible, a path that did not depend on birth or caste, a path that anyone could follow, regardless of their social status. And this made it incredibly powerful, incredibly appealing, especially in a society where the Varna system was becoming more structured and restrictive. And so, as cities grew and kingdoms competed, these new ideas spread. Monks traveling from place to place, teaching, debating, building communities, and gradually the spiritual landscape of India was transformed, not by force, but by thought, by philosophy, by the search for meaning. Meanwhile, among the Mahajanapadas, the political struggle for dominance continued, and one kingdom began to rise above the rest, steadily, relentlessly, building power through strategy, resources, and ambition. That kingdom was Magadha, ruled by kings like Bimbisara, who expanded his territory and strengthened his state. Magadha began to absorb neighboring regions, laying the groundwork for something much larger, something that would go beyond a single kingdom. But power often comes at a cost. Bimbisara's own son, Ajashru, driven by ambition and influenced by darker forces, betrayed him, imprisoning and ultimately causing his death, taking the throne for himself. A moment that reflects a recurring theme in history, that the pursuit of power often leads to betrayal, even within families. Yet Ajatashatru would later regret his actions, especially after becoming a father himself. And in that regret, he turned toward the teachings of the Buddha, seeking redemption, showing once again how deeply these new philosophies were beginning to influence even the most powerful rulers. Under his rule, Magadha expanded further, conquering rival states, strengthening its position, building cities like Pataliputra, which would later become one of the greatest cities in ancient India. And so, by the time this period was coming to an end, India was no longer a land of scattered tribes or small villages. It was a land of cities, kingdoms, philosophies, and competing visions of life itself. The stage was set for empire, and soon a force from outside the subcontinent would arrive, a conqueror whose name would echo across history, pushing into India from the west, bringing with him the legacy of one of the greatest military campaigns the world had ever seen. And his arrival would collide with the rising powers of India in a moment that would change everything. By the time the great kingdoms of northern India had risen into powerful Mahajanapadas, with Magadha standing at the center of this transformation, the subcontinent was no longer isolated from the wider world, because far to the west, beyond mountains and deserts, another force had been rising, a force that had already reshaped the map of the known world, an empire forged through relentless conquest, led by a man whose ambition seemed to have no limits, a man whose name would become legendary. Across continents, Alexander the Great. He had already conquered the vast Achaemenid Empire conquest by Alexander, defeating the mighty Persian Empire and pushing his armies further east than any Greek force had ever gone before. And by the time he turned his gaze toward India around 326 BC, he had spent years campaigning, years marching, years fighting, his army hardened, experienced, but also tired, stretched across thousands of miles from their homeland. To Alexander, India was not just another land. It was the edge of the known world, a place of immense wealth, exotic goods, powerful kingdoms, and perhaps most importantly, a final frontier to conquer, to fulfill his vision of becoming ruler of the entire world. And so he marched, crossing into the northwestern regions of the Indian subcontinent, entering what is now Pakistan. Moving into the Punjab, he encountered not a single unified empire, but a collection of kingdoms and rulers, some choosing to submit, others choosing to resist. Among those who resisted was a king known to the Greeks as Porus, identified in Indian tradition as Porus, a ruler of a region near the Hydaspes River, known today as the Jhelum. What followed was one of the most famous battles of Alexander's campaigns, the Battle of the Hydaspes. It was unlike many of the battles Alexander had fought before. Porus commanded not just infantry and cavalry, but wore elephants, massive, terrifying animals trained for battle, capable of breaking enemy lines, causing chaos among soldiers who had never faced such creatures before. And when the two armies met, it was not a one-sided conquest. Porus fought fiercely. His army resisted with strength and determination, and even though Alexander ultimately won the battle through superior tactics and maneuvering, managing to outflank Porus and surround his forces, it was not an easy victory. It was costly, hard-fought, and deeply impressive. So much so that when Porus was captured and brought before Alexander, instead of executing him or humiliating him, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. And Porus replied, like a king. It was a moment that defined both men. Alexander, recognizing courage and dignity, chose not only to spare Porus, but to restore him to his throne, even granting him additional territory, turning a former enemy into an ally, a decision that would help him maintain control as he pushed further into India. And so Alexander continued eastward, his army marching deeper into unfamiliar lands, facing new challenges, new environments, new resistance, capturing cities like Sangala, expanding his reach. But something had begun to change. His army, though victorious, was exhausted. They had been campaigning for years, far from home, facing unfamiliar climates, monsoon rains, dense forests, and now they heard stories of a powerful kingdom further east, the Nanda Empire, set to command hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of cavalry, and thousands of war elephants, a force far larger than anything they had yet faced. Whether these numbers were exaggerated or not, they had an effect. Fear, fatigue, reluctance. And when Alexander reached the Hyphasis River, known today as the Bias, his army refused to go further. They would not march into the unknown again. They would not face another massive army. They wanted to go home. And for perhaps the first time in his career, Alexander had no choice but to listen. He turned back. His dream of conquering all of India ended not in defeat, but in refusal, in the limits of human endurance, in the reality that even the greatest conqueror could not push his men beyond their breaking point. And so, in 326 BC, Alexander began his journey back west, leaving behind a network of territories, alliances, and satraps, including Porus, who was placed in charge of regions east of the Hydaspes. But Alexander's departure did not bring stability. Within a few years, after his death in 323 BC, his empire fractured, his generals turning against each other, carving up his territories, and the regions he had conquered in India became contested, unstable, vulnerable. And it was in this moment of uncertainty, of shifting power, that a new figure emerged, one who would not just reclaim these lands, but unite much of India under a single empire for the first time in its history. His name was Chandragupta Maurya. His origins are still debated. Some sources claim he was of royal descent. Others suggest he came from humble beginnings, perhaps even raised among peacock keepers. But what is clear is that he was ambitious, intelligent, and driven. And most importantly, he was not alone. By his side was a brilliant strategist and advisor, Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, a man whose political wisdom and cunning would become legendary, credited with guiding Chandragupta's rise to power, helping him navigate the complex political landscape of the time. Together, they set their sights on the Nanda Empire, which ruled Magadha, one of the most powerful states in India at the time, but also one that had grown unpopular among its people, seen as oppressive, wealthy, but disconnected. How exactly Chandragupta overthrew the Nandas is not fully clear, but what we know is that by around 320 BC, he had succeeded. The Nanda dynasty fell, and in its place rose the Mauryan Empire. From there, Chandragupta moved quickly. He consolidated power. He secured Magadha. He expanded outward. And then he turned west, into the territories once held by Alexander. This brought him into conflict with one of Alexander's successors, Seleucus I Nicator, who controlled large parts of the eastern remnants of Alexander's empire. What followed was a confrontation between two powerful forces, but like much of early Indian history, the details are scarce, lost to time, mentioned only briefly in Greek sources. What we do know is the outcome. Chandragupta won. He gained control over territories, including parts of modern Afghanistan and the Indus Valley, securing the northwest frontier of his empire. And in return, he gave Seleucus 500 war elephants, animals that would later play a decisive role in Hellenistic battles, and possibly sealed the alliance through marriage, a union between their families. This was more than a military victory. It was a statement. India was no longer a fragmented land vulnerable to foreign conquest. It was becoming an empire. And at the heart of this empire was its capital, Pataliputra, a city described by the Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who visited Chandragupta's court and recorded what he saw. According to Megasthenes, Pataliputra was a vast and impressive city, surrounded by massive walls stretching for miles, with hundreds of towers and dozens of gates, a place of order, administration, and power. He described a structured society, a system where agriculture was carefully managed, where farmers contributed a portion of their crops to the state, which in turn supported the army and administration, creating a stable and efficient system of governance. Under Chandragupta, the Mauryan Empire expanded rapidly, covering much of northern India, and his son, Bindusara, continued this expansion further south, strengthening the empire even more. For the first time, a large portion of the Indian subcontinent was united under a single political authority. But the Mauryan Empire had not yet reached its peak. That would come under Chandragupta's grandson, a ruler whose story would take a dramatic and unexpected turn, a king who would begin as a conqueror and end as something entirely different, a man remembered not just for power, but for transformation. His name was Ashoka the Great, and his reign would change the course of Indian history forever. As the Mauryan Empire expanded under the strong foundations laid by Chandragupta Maurya and further strengthened by his son Bindusara, it grew into something unprecedented in the history of the Indian subcontinent, a vast, centralized state that stretched across enormous distances, binding together diverse peoples, languages, cultures, and traditions under one rule. And yet, despite all this power, the empire had not yet reached its most defining moment, because that would come under the rule of a man whose life would take one of the most dramatic turns in all of ancient history. That man was Ashoka the Great. When Ashoka first came to power around 268 BC, he was not the peaceful, compassionate ruler that history often remembers. He was a prince shaped by the realities of imperial politics, a man who had to fight for his position, navigating court rivalries, eliminating opposition, and securing his claim to the throne in a system where power was rarely handed over without conflict. And like many rulers of his time, he believed in strength, in expansion, in the idea that a king's greatness was measured by the size of his empire and the might of his army. And so, in the early years of his reign, Ashoka did what powerful rulers did. He went to war. The target of his most significant campaign was a region known as Kalinga, located along the eastern coast of India, roughly corresponding to modern-day Odisha. And unlike many other regions that had already been absorbed into the Mauryan Empire, Kalinga remained independent, strategically important, wealthy, and unwilling to submit. For Ashoka, conquering Kalinga was both a political necessity and a statement of dominance. And so the Mauryan army marched. What followed was the Kalinga War, a conflict that would not only reshape the empire, but redefine the man who led it. The war was brutal. Ancient sources, including Ashoka's own inscriptions, describe it in stark terms. Over 100,000 people killed, even more wounded, and hundreds of thousands displaced, entire communities destroyed, families torn apart, the land itself scarred by violence. But unlike many conquerors who celebrated such victories, Ashoka did something different. He looked at what he had done, and he was horrified. In one of his famous edicts, carved in a stone for all to see, he expressed deep remorse for the suffering caused by the war, not just the deaths, but the pain inflicted on families, on innocents, on people who had nothing to do with the conflict, and this moment of reflection changed him completely. Ashoka did not just regret the war. He rejected the very idea of conquest through violence. He turned away from expansion through bloodshed and embraced a new path, a path inspired by the teachings of Gautama Buddha, adopting Buddhism not just as a personal belief, but as a guiding principle for his rule. This transformation is one of the most remarkable in history, because Ashoka did not abdicate his throne, he did not withdraw from power. Instead, he chose to rule differently, to redefine what it meant to be a king. He began promoting what he called Dhamma, a moral code based on compassion, non-violence, tolerance, and respect for all living beings. And unlike religious dogma, Dhamma was not about forcing people to follow a specific faith, it was about ethical living, about creating a society where people could coexist peacefully despite differences in belief. To spread these ideas, Ashoka did something extraordinary. He had them carved into stone. Across his empire, he erected pillars and rock edicts, inscriptions written in local languages so that ordinary people could understand them. Messages that spoke not of conquest or glory, but of morality, kindness, and responsibility. These edicts are some of the most important historical sources we have for ancient India, because they're direct words from the emperor himself, not filtered through later writers, not exaggerated in a legend, but real statements of intent and reflection. In them, Ashoka speaks of his regret, his commitment to nonviolence, his desire to care for his people, and his efforts to ensure justice and fairness across his empire. He ordered the construction of hospitals, not just for humans, but for animals as well, showing a deep concern for all forms of life. He had wells dug along roads, trees planted to provide shade for travelers, rest houses built for those journeying across the vast empire, small but meaningful acts that reflected a ruler who saw his role not just as a conqueror, but as a caretaker. He also supported the spread of Buddhism, not through force, but through patronage and encouragement, sending missionaries to distant lands, including Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and even regions influenced by the Greek world, helping transform Buddhism from a regional philosophy into a global religion. Under Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire reached its greatest extent, covering nearly the entire Indian subcontinent except for parts of the far south, becoming one of the largest empires of the ancient world. And yet its greatest achievement was not territorial expansion, but ideological influence. But even as Ashoka's reign is remembered as a high point, a golden era of moral governance, it also carried within it the seeds of future weakness. Because ruling such a vast empire required strong administration, strong military presence, and constant control, and Ashoka's commitment to nonviolence, while admirable, may have reduced the empire's ability to respond to threats, both internal and external. And after his death in 232 BC, these weaknesses began to show. His successors did not possess the same authority, the same vision, or the same respect. The empire began to fragment. Regional governors, once loyal, started asserting independence. The centralized system weakened, and within a few decades, the Mauryan Empire, which had once unified most of India, began to break apart. The final blow came around 185 BC, when the last Mauryan ruler was assassinated by one of his own generals, Pushyamitra Shunga, who then established the Shunga dynasty, marking the end of Mauryan rule. And with that, the first great empire of India came to an end. But its legacy did not disappear. The idea of a unified India, the spread of Buddhism, the model of governance, the cultural and philosophical developments, all of these would continue to influence the subcontinent for centuries to come. Yet what followed was not stability. It was fragmentation, a return to multiple kingdoms, competing powers, shifting alliances, and a period that historians often struggle to fully reconstruct, because the records become sparse, unclear, incomplete. And into this fragmented landscape came new forces, foreign invaders, new dynasties, new cultural exchanges. Because India was no longer isolated, it was deeply connected to the wider world through trade, through migration, through conflict, and the next phase of its history would be shaped not just by internal dynamics, but by interactions with distant civilizations, from the Greeks to the Central Asians and beyond. The story was far from over. In fact, it was about to become even more complex. When the great structure of the Mauryan Empire finally fractured after the death of Ashoka the Great, it did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. There was no one battle, no one conqueror who brought it all down. Instead, it unraveled slowly, like a vast fabric losing its threads one by one. And as central authority weakened, the immense territory that had once been unified under one rule began to split apart into smaller kingdoms. Regional powers rising and falling, alliances forming and breaking. And for historians, this period becomes harder to clearly trace because the records grow thinner, the voices fewer, and yet despite this, the subcontinent was anything but silent. In fact, this era, often described as chaotic or even labeled a dark age due to the scarcity of written sources, was in reality a time of intense movement, interaction, and transformation, a period where India became deeply entangled with the wider world, not isolated, but connected more than ever before as waves of new peoples entered the subcontinent and trade routes expanded across continents. One of the first major shifts came from the northwest, the same region where centuries earlier Alexander the Great had entered India. Because after the fragmentation of his empire, Greek-descended kingdoms remained active in Central Asia, particularly in the region of Bactria, and from there, Indo-Greek rulers began pushing into the Indian subcontinent. These Indo-Greek kingdoms established control over parts of northwestern India, bringing with them not just armies, but culture, art, and ideas, blending Greek and Indian traditions in ways that can still be seen in archaeological remains, especially in sculpture, where Greek artistic realism merged with Indian themes, giving rise to unique forms of expression. But the Greeks were only the beginning. They were followed by waves of Central Asian groups, including the Sakas, also known as Scythians, nomadic warriors who moved into northwestern India and established their own rule. And then came another group, the Yuezhi, who would eventually form one of the most powerful kingdoms of this era. From these shifting movements emerged the Kushan Empire, a powerful state that controlled vast territories across modern-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. And under rulers like Kanishk, the Kushan Empire became not just a political force, but a cultural bridge between worlds. The Kushans sat at the crossroads of major trade routes, connecting India with Central Asia, China, and even the Roman Empire. And through these routes flowed goods, ideas, religions, and people, creating a network of exchange that made India a central player in a much larger global system. Trade flourished. Indian merchants exported spices, textiles, precious stones, ivory, and luxury goods that were highly prized in distant lands, and in return, gold and silver flowed into India, especially from the Roman Empire, whose elites developed a strong appetite for Indian products. Roman coins, bearing the faces of emperors like Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, have been found scattered across Indian archaeological sites, silent evidence of a thriving trade network that stretched across thousands of miles. Roman writers even complained about the amount of wealth leaving their empire to pay for Indian goods, a sign of just how valuable these trade connections had become. And it wasn't just goods that moved along these routes. Ideas traveled too. Buddhist monks journeyed north and east, carrying the teachings of Gautama Buddha into Central Asia and China, where Buddhism would take root and evolve into new forms, spreading further into East and Southeast Asia, becoming one of the most influential religions in the world. At the same time, Indian cultural influence extended into Southeast Asia, where Indian art, language, religion, and political ideas began to shape emerging societies, leaving a legacy that would last for centuries. So while political fragmentation might suggest weakness, in many ways, this was a period of expansion, not through conquest, but through connection. And while the North experienced waves of invasions and shifting powers, the south of India was undergoing its own remarkable development, largely independent of these northern dynamics. In the southern regions, a distinct cultural world flourished, often referred to as Tamilakam, a land dominated by Tamil language and culture, covering areas of modern Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and parts of surrounding regions. And here, a different kind of history was unfolding. Unlike the North, where the Varna system was becoming more rigid, early Tamil society appears to have been structured differently, with its own social systems, its own traditions, and its own literary culture. One of the most important sources for understanding this period is the Sangam literature, a collection of ancient Tamil poems composed between roughly the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century CE, works that provide not just artistic beauty, but detailed insights into everyday life, politics, war, love, and social structure. These poems describe a world of warrior kings, brave battles, romantic relationships, and complex human emotions, painting a vivid picture of a society that was both sophisticated and deeply connected to its environment. Politically, southern India was dominated by 3 major dynasties, the Chera, the Chola, and the Pandya, often referred to as the 3 crowned kings, and these powers competed for dominance over the region, engaging in warfare, forming alliances, and building their own centers of power. Among them, the Pandya dynasty was particularly prominent during this period, with its capital at Madurai becoming a major center of culture and learning, especially for the production of Sangam literature. Trade also played a crucial role in the south, with ports along the Indian Ocean connecting southern India to distant lands, facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas, and making the region an important part of global trade networks. Meanwhile, in the Deccan Plateau, another important power emerged, the Satavahana dynasty, which ruled large parts of central India for several centuries, acting as a bridge between northern and southern cultures and controlling key trade routes that connected inland regions to coastal ports. Under rulers like Gautamiputra Satakarni, the Satavahanas expanded their territory and challenged the influence of foreign groups like the Sakas, asserting their dominance and contributing to the political complexity of the time. And yet, despite all these developments, one thing remained consistent. India was not unified. It was a mosaic, a vast, diverse, ever-changing landscape of kingdoms, cultures, languages, and ideas, interacting, competing, evolving. But history has a way of cycling. Periods of fragmentation are often followed by periods of unification. And as this era progressed, new powers began to rise, new dynasties preparing to bring parts of the subcontinent together once again. Not in the same way as the Mauryans, but in a new form shaped by the lessons of the past. Among these emerging powers, one would stand out, rising in the north, building an empire that would usher in what many consider a golden age of Indian civilization, a time of remarkable achievements in science, mathematics, art, and culture. That power was the Gupta Empire. And with its rise, India would once again enter a new chapter, one defined not just by political strength, but by intellectual brilliance. As centuries passed after the fall of the Mauryan Empire, with waves of foreign rulers, regional kingdoms, and vibrant trade networks shaping the subcontinent, India slowly moved toward another moment of consolidation. Not sudden, not obvious at first, but steady, patient, and powerful. And from this gradual shift emerged a new dynasty that would come to define one of the most celebrated eras in Indian history. The Gupta Empire. Unlike the Mauryans, whose rise was marked by dramatic conquest and sweeping unification, the origins of the Guptas are far more obscure, almost quiet, as if history itself did not fully notice them at first. And even today, historians are not entirely certain where exactly they came from or how they first established their authority. But what is clear is that by the early 4th century CE, they had begun to expand their influence across northern India, laying the groundwork for what would become a powerful and enduring empire. The early ruler Chandragupta is often credited with formally establishing the dynasty's prominence, not just through military strength, but through strategic alliances, including marriage into influential families, strengthening his position and giving legitimacy to his rule, and he adopted the grand title of Maharaja, meaning King of Kings, signaling that the Guptas were no longer just another regional power. They were aiming for something much greater. But it was his successor, Samudragupta, who truly transformed the Gupta state into an empire, and his reign reads almost like an epic of conquest, recorded in inscriptions that describe a series of campaigns across northern India, subduing rival kings, expanding territory, and establishing dominance not only through force but through diplomacy. What makes Samudragupta particularly interesting is the way he ruled conquered territories, because unlike rulers who simply annexed everything into direct control, he often allowed defeated kings to remain in power as tributaries, acknowledging Gupta supremacy while maintaining local governance, a flexible approach that allowed the empire to expand without overstretching itself. This model of indirect rule would become one of the defining features of the Gupta Empire, allowing it to manage vast regions with a relatively stable system, balancing central authority with regional autonomy. His campaigns extended into the Ganges Valley, central India, and even reached into southern regions, though not all areas were directly annexed. Some were simply brought into the Gupta sphere of influence, showing a level of political sophistication that allowed the empire to grow without collapsing under its own weight. Following him, rulers like Chandragupta II, also known as Vikramaditya, continued this expansion, pushing westward into regions previously controlled by the Sakas, defeating them and securing access to important trade routes and coastal regions, further strengthening the empire economically and strategically. And under these rulers, the Gupta Empire reached its peak, stretching across much of northern and eastern India, exerting influence far beyond its core territories, and creating a period of relative peace and stability that allowed something extraordinary to happen. A flourishing of culture, knowledge, and creativity so profound that historians would later call it the Golden Age of India. But this Golden Age was not just about kings and conquests. It was about people, scholars, thinkers, artists, individuals whose contributions would shape not only India but the entire world. At the heart of this intellectual explosion was a place known as Nalanda University, located in modern-day Bihar, a center of learning that attracted students and scholars from across Asia, a place where knowledge was pursued with dedication and curiosity, where subjects ranging from philosophy and religion to medicine, mathematics, and astronomy were studied in depth. Nalanda was not just a school. It was an institution of immense scale and influence, with thousands of students and teachers, libraries filled with texts, and an environment that encouraged debate, exploration, and intellectual growth. Among the many scholars associated with this era, one name stands out above all in the field of mathematics and astronomy: Aryabhata. Aryabhata lived during the 5th century and made discoveries that were centuries ahead of their time. He calculated the value of pi with remarkable accuracy, approximating it as 3.1416, a level of precision that would not be matched in many parts of the world for a long time, and he proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis. A revolutionary idea in an age when many believed the heavens revolved around stationary Earth. He also provided explanations for eclipses, rejecting supernatural interpretations and instead describing them in terms of shadows and celestial mechanics, showing a commitment to observation and reasoning that reflects a highly advanced scientific mindset. And he was not alone. Other scholars like Varahamihira contributed to fields such as astronomy, mathematics, and astrology, helping to develop systems of knowledge that would influence later generations both within and beyond India. One of the most important contributions of Indian mathematics during this period was the formal use of zero as a number, not just a placeholder, but a concept with its own value, something that would eventually become fundamental to mathematics across the world, shaping everything from basic arithmetic to advanced science and technology. But the Gupta Golden Age was not just about science and mathematics. It was also a time of literary and artistic brilliance. Great works of literature were composed or compiled during this period, including the epics Mahabharata and Ramayana, reaching forms that are recognizable today, stories that continue to be told, retold, and revered across generations. These epics are not just stories. They are cultural foundations, filled with themes of duty, honor, morality, love, war, and the complexities of human life, shaping the values and imagination of millions. In religion, the Gupta period marked the rise and consolidation of Hinduism as a dominant cultural force, building upon earlier Vedic traditions, but evolving into more structured forms of worship, temple building, and devotional practices. The concept of the Trimurti, the three principal deities, Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer, became more prominent, and the worship of Vishnu and his avatars, including figures like Krishna, gained widespread popularity. Temples began to be constructed in stone, creating architectural styles that would influence Indian art for centuries, and religious texts were codified, preserved, and expanded, giving shape to beliefs that are still followed today. But even in this golden age, not everything was equal or ideal. Social structures became more rigid. The caste system, which had its roots in earlier Vedic society, became more firmly established, influencing social roles, opportunities, and interactions in increasingly fixed ways. Women, who in earlier periods had enjoyed relatively more freedom in certain aspects, began to face greater restrictions, with social expectations limiting their roles and independence, showing that even in times of intellectual and cultural brilliance, inequalities could deepen. Still, for many, this was a time of prosperity. Travelers like the Chinese monk Faxian, who visited India during this period, described a society where people were generally well off, where charity institutions and hospitals existed, where travelers could find support, and where governance appeared stable and organized. But as history has shown time and again, no empire remains at its peak forever. The very structure that allowed the Gupta Empire to thrive, its reliance on regional rulers and indirect control, would eventually become a weakness. Over time, local governors grew more independent, less loyal to the central authority, and as internal cohesion weakened, external threats began to rise. From the northwest came new invaders, groups collectively referred to as the Huns, fierce warriors who began attacking Gupta territories, straining the empire's resources, forcing it into defensive conflicts that it struggled to sustain. And slowly, over decades, the empire began to decline. Territories were lost. Authority weakened. The golden age faded. By the mid-6th century, the Gupta Empire had effectively dissolved, leaving behind a legacy of remarkable achievements, but also a familiar pattern: unity giving way to fragmentation once again. And as the subcontinent entered another period of shifting powers and regional kingdoms, new leaders would rise, new battles would be fought, and the story of India would continue, shaped by both its past and the forces that continued to challenge it. When the Gupta Empire finally dissolved in the 6th century, it did not leave behind a stable successor or a clear transfer of power. Instead, it opened the door to yet another long period of fragmentation. With a political unity that had briefly brought much of northern India together once again, gave way to a landscape of competing kingdoms, shifting alliances, rising warlords, and constant conflict. And yet, just like the periods that followed the fall of the Mauryans, this was not a time of stagnation. It was a time of movement, of transformation, of new powers rising from the ashes of old ones. The collapse of Gupta authority created a vacuum, and as always, vacuums invite struggle. Regional governors who had once served under the Guptas began asserting independence, carving out their own territories, declaring themselves kings, and in doing so, they transformed what had once been provinces into independent states, each seeking dominance over its neighbors. And this led to a political environment that was far more volatile than before, where warfare became frequent and alliances were often temporary. At the same time, external pressures continued. Groups from Central Asia, including remnants of the Huns, had already weakened the Gupta structure, and even after being pushed back, the damage they caused left lasting scars, destabilizing regions and forcing local rulers to focus on defense rather than expansion, further fragmenting the subcontinent. And yet, even in this fractured landscape, certain leaders emerged who attempted to bring order back to chaos, to rebuild something resembling unity. And among them, one name stands out more than most, a ruler who would briefly restore a sense of cohesion to northern India. That ruler was Harsha. Harsha's story does not begin in strength, but in crisis. He moved quickly. He secured his power. He rescued his sister, who was on the verge of committing sati, the ritual self-immolation of a widow on her husband's funeral pyre, a practice that, while not universal, had begun to appear more frequently in certain parts of Indian society, reflecting changing attitudes toward women and social expectations. From that moment, Harsha did not simply inherit a kingdom. He fought to build one. Through a series of military campaigns, he expanded his control across much of northern India, bringing various kingdoms and republics under his authority, not always through direct conquest, but often through diplomacy, alliances, and strategic submission, creating a network of power that allowed him to rule a large territory without needing absolute control over every region. But what makes Harsha particularly remarkable is not just his military success, but the way he governed. Unlike many rulers defined purely by conquest, Harsha is remembered as a king who valued administration, culture, and intellectual life, a ruler who did not isolate himself in palaces, but instead traveled extensively across his empire, personally overseeing governance, addressing issues, and engaging with his subjects. He was also known for his religious tolerance. Although he showed strong support for Buddhism, he did not impose it on his people. Instead, he patronized both Buddhist institutions and Hindu traditions, supporting scholars, monks, and priests alike, reflecting a society where multiple belief systems coexisted and influenced one another. Harsha himself was not just a ruler, but also a patron of the arts and even a creator, credited with writing plays, including works that range from religious themes to romantic narratives, showing a side of kingship that was deeply connected to culture and expression. Much of what we know about Harsha comes from two important sources. One is his court poet Banapada, who wrote a biography known as the Harshakarita, one of the earliest surviving royal biographies in India, offering insights into Harsha's life, though naturally with a tone that praises his patron. The other is the Chinese monk Xuanzang, who traveled to India during Harsha's reign and spent time at his court, leaving detailed accounts of the political and cultural conditions of the time, describing Harsha as a just and capable ruler, and providing valuable information about Indian society during this period. Through Xuanzang's accounts, we learn about thriving cities, active trade, and a society that, despite political fragmentation, continued to function with complexity and vitality. Harsha even established diplomatic relations with China, sending envoys to the Tang dynasty court, marking one of the early formal interactions between these two great civilizations. And yet, despite all his achievements, Harsha's empire was fragile, because like many rulers before him, he did not establish a strong system of succession. When he died in 647 CE without a clear heir, his empire quickly disintegrated. The unity he had created could not survive him. And once again, India returned to fragmentation. But while the north was caught in cycles of rise and collapse, the Deccan and southern regions were experiencing their own intense political developments, particularly with the rise of powerful dynasties like the Chalukyas. The Chalukya dynasty, ruling from their capital at Badami, became one of the dominant forces in central and southern India, and their history is filled with warfare, ambition, and powerful rulers, among whom Pulakshin II stands out. Pulakshin II's rise to power was not smooth. After his father's death, his uncle attempted to seize control of the throne, leading to a period of internal conflict. But once Pulakshin came of age, he fought back, defeated his uncle, and secured his rightful position, proving himself early as a capable and determined leader. And once in power, he did not remain passive. He launched campaigns across the Deccan, defeating neighboring kingdoms, expanding his territory, and establishing himself as one of the most formidable rulers of his time. One of his most famous achievements was his confrontation with Harsha, where Pulakshin successfully halted Harsha's expansion into the Deccan, defeating his forces near the Nirmada River, effectively establishing a boundary between northern and southern powers. This was a significant moment. It showed that even powerful northern rulers could not easily dominate the south, reinforcing the idea that the Indian subcontinent was not just one political space, but many. Pulakshin's successes continued for years, but like many great rulers, his story also ended in conflict, particularly with the Pallavas to the south, leading to a series of wars that eventually resulted in the invasion of his capital and his death in battle. And so, once again, the pattern repeated. Rise, expansion, conflict, collapse. Across the subcontinent, kingdoms rose and fell, fought and fragmented, rebuilt and broke apart. And through it all, India remained dynamic, never static, always evolving. But something new was beginning to appear on the horizon. Beyond the internal struggles, beyond the familiar cycles of Indian history, a new force was rising far to the west, one that would soon begin to interact with the subcontinent in ways that would reshape its future once again. A force driven not just by conquest, but by a new religious and political energy. And its arrival would mark the beginning of a new era in Indian history. As the Indian subcontinent continued through its cycles of rising and falling kingdoms, of regional powers clashing and reshaping the land, something was changing beyond its borders, something that would soon reach into India and alter its history in ways no previous wave of invaders or traders had done before. Because far to the west, in the deserts of Arabia, a new force had emerged, not just a kingdom, not just an empire, but a civilization driven by a powerful unifying idea. This force was Islam. In the early 7th century, the teachings of Prophet Muhammad began to spread across Arabia, uniting tribes that had long been divided. And within a few decades, this new religious and political movement expanded rapidly, forming a vast empire that stretched across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Central Asia, carried forward by both faith and conquest. By the time this expansion reached the edges of the Indian subcontinent, it had already transformed entire regions, and it would not stop at the borders. The first major point of contact between Islamic forces and India came in the early 8th century, when an Umayyad general named Muhammad bin Qasim led an Abhiyan into the region of Sindh, in what is now southern Pakistan. This was not just a raid, it was a conquest. Muhammad bin Qasim's campaign in 711 CE resulted in the defeat of the local ruler, Raja Dahir, and the establishment of Islamic rule in parts of the northwestern subcontinent, marking the first significant and lasting foothold of Islam in India. But what is important to understand is that this was not an immediate transformation of the entire region. Islam did not suddenly replace existing religions or cultures. Instead, it entered into a complex and layered society, interacting with existing traditions, coexisting with local populations, and gradually becoming part of the subcontinent's diverse cultural fabric. In many cases, local rulers were allowed to remain in power under Islamic governance, paying tribute while maintaining control over their territories, a pattern that echoes earlier systems of indirect rule seen in Indian empires. And over time, trade, migration, and cultural exchange further deepened the presence of Islam in the region, especially along coastal areas where Arab traders had already been active for centuries, establishing communities that blended local and foreign influences. But while these early interactions were significant, they were still limited in scope. The deeper and more transformative phase of Islamic expansion into India would come later, driven by new powers rising in Central Asia. Because beyond the northwestern frontier, the political landscape was shifting once again. Turkic and Afghan groups were rising to prominence, many of them adopting Islam and becoming part of the broader Islamic world. And among these emerging powers were rulers who saw India not just as a distant land, but as a place of immense wealth and opportunity. One of the earliest and most famous of these figures was Mahmud of Ghazni. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Mahmud launched a series of raids into northern India, not with the goal of permanent conquest at first, but to extract wealth, targeting rich temples and cities, bringing back immense treasures to his capital in Ghazni. These raids were frequent, intense, and impactful, disrupting local kingdoms, weakening existing powers, and opening the door for further incursions. But Mahmud's campaigns were only the beginning. The real turning point came with the rise of another Central Asian power, the Ghurids, and particularly with one man, Muhammad of Ghor. Unlike Mahmud, Muhammad of Ghor was not satisfied with raids. He wanted control. In the late 12th century, he launched campaigns into northern India with the goal of establishing lasting rule. And in doing so, he encountered one of the most famous Indian rulers of the time, Prithviraj Chauhan. Their conflict would become legendary. In the First Battle of Taurain in 1191, Prithviraj Chauhan defeated Muhammad of Ghor, halting his advance and securing a temporary victory for the Indian forces. But the story did not end there. Muhammad of Ghor returned the following year, better prepared, more determined. And in the Second Battle of Taurain in 1192, he defeated Prithviraj Chauhan, a decisive moment that opened the gates of northern India to Ghurid control. This victory was not just another battle. It marked the beginning of a new political era. Because after Muhammad of Ghor's campaigns, his generals and successors established what would become one of the most important political institutions in medieval Indian history, the Delhi Sultanate. Centered in the city of Delhi, the Sultanate became the dominant power in northern India, ruled by a series of dynasties. including the Mamluks, the Khaljis, the Tughlaqs, the Sayyids, and the Lodis, each contributing to the shaping of this new political structure. The Delhi Sultanate was different from previous Indian empires in several key ways. It was more centralized in some respects, with a strong military and administrative system, and it introduced new cultural, architectural, and linguistic influences, blending Persian, Central Asian, and Indian traditions into something new. Cities like Delhi became vibrant centers of culture, trade, and governance, where different communities interacted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in tension, but always shaping the evolving identity of the subcontinent. Islamic architecture began to leave its mark, with mosques, forts, and monuments rising across the landscape, many of which still stand today as reminders of this transformative period. But just like every era before it, the Sultanate was not without its struggles. It faced constant challenges from internal rebellions, from rival kingdoms, and from external threats, including the devastating invasion of Timur in 1398, which brought destruction to Delhi and exposed the vulnerabilities of the Sultanate. And yet, despite these challenges, the Delhi Sultanate endured for centuries, maintaining its influence and shaping the political and cultural landscape of northern India. At the same time, in the south, powerful Hindu kingdoms like the Vijayanagara Empire rose in response, creating a balance of power that defined much of the medieval period. So now, the subcontinent was no longer just a mosaic of ancient traditions and regional kingdoms. It had become something more complex, a land where multiple civilizations met, interacted, clashed, and blended. A land where new identities were forming, shaped by both continuity and change. And as this medieval world continued to evolve, another power was rising, one that would surpass all before it in scale, wealth, and influence. A power that would once again unite much of India under a single rule. A power known as the Mughal Empire. By the early 16th century, the northern subcontinent had become a patchwork of sultanates, regional kingdoms, and decentralized powers. Despite the centuries of Islamic influence under the Delhi Sultanate, the political landscape remained fragmented, leaving openings for a new power to rise from beyond the northwestern frontiers. This power came in the form of the Mughals, a dynasty descended from both Timur and Genghis Khan, who combined Central Asian heritage with strategic acumen, military prowess, and an ambitious vision to unify India under a single rule. The pivotal figure in this transition was Babur. Born in 1483 in the region of Fergana, modern Uzbekistan, Babur was a descendant of Timur through his father and Genghis Khan through his mother. From his early youth, he displayed both a keen interest in military campaigns and a literary talent that would later manifest in his memoirs, the Baburnama, which provide invaluable insight into the political, cultural, and social context of Central and South Asia during this period. Babur's early years were marked by struggle. The inheritance he received was a small kingdom in the Fergana Valley, but he was constantly challenged by rival claimants. Driven out multiple times, he made repeated efforts to regain his ancestral lands. Yet, the shifting dynamics of Central Asia, combined with the opportunity to expand southward into India, redirected his ambitions. India represented a land of immense opportunity, wealthy cities, fertile plains, and fractured political entities ripe for conquest. This vision culminated in his decisive move into the Indian subcontinent in 1526. The defining moment came at the First Battle of Panipat. Babur's forces, though smaller in number compared to the army of the reigning Sultan of Delhi, Ibrahim Lodi, leveraged superior tactics, disciplined artillery, and innovative field strategies. The battle ended with the defeat of Ibrahim Lodi, signaling the end of the Lodi dynasty and the Delhi Sultanate, and the beginning of Mughal rule in India. The psychological and political impact of this victory cannot be overstated. For the first time in centuries, a single leader held the potential to unify vast stretches of northern India, creating the framework for an empire that would endure for over 3 centuries. Babur's reign, however, was not merely about conquest. Though he spent only a brief period in India, 1526 to 1530, He laid the foundations of administration, culture, and military organization that would define the Mughal Empire. He introduced new military tactics, emphasizing the use of field artillery, mobile cavalry, and a flexible chain of command that allowed for rapid responses to insurgencies and challenges from regional powers. At the same time, Babur encouraged the blending of Persian, Central Asian, and Indian cultural elements, setting a precedent for the syncretic Mughal culture that would flourish under his successors. Following Babur's death, the empire passed to his son, Humayun. Humayun faced significant challenges, both from internal rebellions and external threats. Among the most formidable of these was Sher Shah Suri, a former officer in the Lodi administration who had risen to power in the eastern regions of India. Sher Shah defeated Humayun in the early 1540s, forcing the Mughal emperor into exile. Despite this setback, Sher Shah's administration and reforms, particularly in revenue collection and road construction, would leave a lasting imprint on India, and Humayun's eventual return in 1555 re-established Mughal authority, allowing his son Akbar to inherit a foundation for expansion and consolidation. Akbar, reigned 1556 to 1605, would prove to be the most transformative of the early Mughal rulers. His reign marked the peak of early Mughal consolidation, political sophistication, and cultural synthesis. Akbar inherited an empire that, while strategically positioned, was still fragmented by competing sultanates, Rajput kingdoms, and tribal groups. Through a combination of military prowess, strategic alliances, administrative innovation, and religious diplomacy, Akbar expanded the Mughal territories across northern, central, and parts of Western India. He relied heavily on both cavalry and artillery, incorporating the latest techniques from Central Asia while adapting them to the diverse terrain of the subcontinent. One of Akbar's most enduring achievements was the creation of an administrative framework that balanced central authority with local governance. He implemented a system known as the Mansabdari, which assigned military and civil ranks to officials based on loyalty, ability, and service. This system allowed for an integrated bureaucracy that could efficiently manage the collection of revenue, enforcement of law, and deployment of military forces across vast and diverse regions. By standardizing taxation, land assessment, and revenue collection, Akbar ensured a stable economic base that supported both the military and cultural ambitions of the empire. Akbar's approach to governance was also notable for its emphasis on religious and cultural inclusivity. Recognizing the diversity of India's population, which included Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Christians, Buddhists, and tribal faiths, Akbar pursued policies designed to reduce sectarian conflict. He abolished certain discriminatory taxes, such as the jizya on non-Muslims, and encouraged dialogue between religious scholars of different traditions. He even attempted to develop a syncretic faith known as Din-i-Ilahi, which sought to blend elements of multiple religions, though it did not gain mass following. Nevertheless, it demonstrated a pragmatic and innovative approach to leadership that prioritized political stability and cultural cohesion. Culturally, Akbar's reign saw the flowering of Mughal art, architecture, and literature. The construction of fortified cities, palaces, and gardens exemplified a synthesis of Persian, Central Asian, and Indian styles, while patronage of scholars, poets, and artists encouraged a vibrant intellectual environment. Akbar's court became a center for the collection of historical texts, the commissioning of illustrated manuscripts, and the translation of important works into local languages, facilitating the diffusion of knowledge and cross-cultural exchange. These developments reinforced the empire's identity not only as a political entity, but as a hub of culture and learning. After Akbar, his grandson Shah Jahan would oversee a period of architectural magnificence. The construction of monuments, such as the Taj Mahal, immortalized the empire's aesthetic and engineering achievements. These grand projects served as symbols of power, faith, and cultural synthesis, integrating Persian, Indian, and Islamic architectural elements. The Mughal architectural style established during this period would influence generations of builders across the subcontinent. Alongside monumental construction, The Mughal economy thrived under policies that encouraged agriculture, trade, and crafts. Revenue reforms, standardized coinage, and market regulation facilitated both internal commerce and international trade. India became a hub for luxury goods, including textiles, spices, and jewelry, attracting merchants from Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. The Mughal strategic control of rivers, ports, and trade routes allowed them to integrate local economies into a broader imperial system, further consolidating their political and cultural influence. Despite the apparent stability and prosperity, the Mughal Empire faced ongoing challenges, including succession disputes, regional revolts, and external threats from emerging powers in Central Asia and Europe. The administrative sophistication of the empire required constant attention to prevent decentralization and rebellion, a pattern that would repeat throughout its history. Yet, the foundational systems established under Akbar, Humayun, and Babur provided resilience and adaptability, allowing the empire to endure over successive generations. By the 17th century, the Mughal Empire had established itself as one of the most powerful and culturally influential states in the world. Its military, economic, and cultural achievements reshaped the subcontinent, laying the groundwork for both the later encounters with European powers and the complex social, religious, and political landscapes that would define India in the early modern period. The Mughal model combines Central Asian military traditions, Persian administrative sophistication, and Indian social dynamics, producing a uniquely integrated imperial system that could govern millions of subjects across a diverse and expansive territory. The reign of Aurangzeb, 1658 to 1707, represents both the zenith and the beginning of transformation for the Mughal Empire. Aurangzeb, the sixth son of Shah Jahan, was a figure of extraordinary administrative capability, military acumen, and religious orthodoxy. Unlike his predecessors, who had largely pursued a policy of cultural synthesis and accommodation, Aurangzeb emphasized a stricter interpretation of Islamic law, reinforcing the authority of the Sharia in both governance and social regulation. While this approach appealed to conservative factions within the empire, it also exacerbated tensions among Hindu, Sikh, and regional communities, sowing the seeds for resistance and regional fragmentation. Aurangzeb's rise to power was marked by political intrigue and familial conflict. Following a bitter struggle for succession, he deposed his father Shah Jahan and confined him to the Agra fort, securing his position through both political cunning and military strength. Once enthroned, Aurangzeb undertook an ambitious campaign of territorial consolidation. He sought to extend Mughal influence into the Deccan, subduing the independent sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda. These military campaigns, though ultimately successful, placed enormous strain on the empire's resources and necessitated the sustained mobilization of large armies across difficult terrain. The Deccan campaigns, while strategically significant, revealed structural challenges inherent in the Mughal imperial system. Maintaining control over distant territories required a combination of military presence, administrative oversight, and local alliances. The logistics of supplying troops, managing taxation, and mediating between local elites created complex demands on the central administration. While Aurangzeb's generals and administrators proved capable, the empire's overextension began to reveal limits to centralized control. Local rulers, including Marathas, Rajputs, and regional sultanates, increasingly asserted autonomy, using both military resistance and diplomatic negotiation to resist Mughal hegemony. One of the most significant internal challenges during Aurangzeb's reign came from the rise of the Marathas. Originating in the rugged terrain of the western Deccan under the leadership of Shivaji, the Marathas combined guerrilla tactics, mobile cavalry, and knowledge of local geography to resist Mughal incursions. Shivaji's campaigns were notable not only for their military effectiveness, but also for their administrative sophistication, as he established a parallel governance system that included revenue collection, fortification management, and legal administration. The conflict between the Mughals and the Marathas was protracted, draining resources and forcing the empire to divert attention from other strategic priorities. Beyond the Deccan, the Mughal Empire faced persistent challenges from regional and religious movements. In the northwest, Afghan tribes under leaders such as Durrani Ahmad Shah began asserting influence, while in the Punjab, Sikh communities organized both religious and military structures to resist both Mughal taxation and persecution. Aurangzeb's enforcement of the jizya tax on non-Muslims, coupled with destruction of certain Hindu temples, further fueled resistance, creating an environment of recurring rebellions that demanded continual military engagement. These dynamics illustrate the tension between centralized authority and the subcontinent's inherent political pluralism. Economically, Aurangzeb's reign was characterized by both continuity and strain. The Mughal economy had long benefited from fertile agricultural lands, trade in luxury goods, and the integration of regional economies through standardized taxation and currency. The Deccan campaigns and northern military expenditures, however, required increased revenue extraction, placing pressure on both peasantry and local officials. While trade with Europe and the Middle East continued, the logistical and financial demands of prolonged military campaigns gradually constrained the empire's capacity to invest in infrastructure and cultural patronage at the level seen under Akbar and Shah Jahan. Culturally, Aurangzeb's reign marked a departure from the syncretic artistic flourishes of his predecessors. While architecture and the arts continued, they were often characterized by austerity and functionalism rather than the ornamental grandeur of earlier Mughal projects. Libraries, schools, and centers of learning were supported selectively, often with an emphasis on Islamic jurisprudence and religious scholarship. Nevertheless, the administrative structures, record-keeping, and literary output of the period provided a foundation for historical understanding of both governance and society, preserving accounts of local events, fiscal systems, and military campaigns. Aurangzeb's death in 1707 triggered a succession crisis that exposed the structural vulnerabilities of the empire. Unlike earlier periods when clear succession mechanisms allowed relatively smooth transitions, the lack of institutionalized rules of inheritance led to a series of civil wars among princes. These conflicts weakened central authority, emboldened regional powers, and encouraged external actors, including European trading companies, to expand influence in local affairs. The post-Aurangzeb period saw a decline in centralized control, with provinces increasingly asserting autonomy and local dynasties emerging to fill the vacuum created by the weakening Mughal administration. The 18th century marked the acceleration of these trends. The Marathas consolidated their power across central and western India, imposing tribute on weaker states and gradually undermining Mughal authority. In the north, Afghan invasions led by Nadir Shah in 1739 further destabilized the empire. The sack of Delhi not only inflicted massive material and human losses, but also symbolically shattered the aura of Mughal invincibility. Concurrently, internal rebellions, such as those led by Rajputs, Jats, and Sikhs, revealed the growing inability of the central government to enforce uniform control across its nominal territories. During this period, the presence of European powers introduced new economic and political dynamics. The British East India Company, French East India Company, and Dutch trading companies established coastal footholds, using trade concessions and political alliances to expand influence. Initially, these European entities operated primarily as commercial intermediaries, focusing on textiles, spices, and precious metals. Over time, however, their military capabilities and strategic maneuvering allowed them to participate directly in regional politics, often supporting or opposing local rulers in exchange for trade privileges, forts, and territorial concessions. The interplay between declining Mughal authority and rising regional powers created a complex geopolitical landscape. In Bengal, a wealthy and densely populated province, local rulers gradually asserted independence, culminating in the establishment of the Nawab of Bengal system, which exercised de facto autonomy while nominally recognizing Mughal suzerainty. Similar patterns emerged in Awadh, Hyderabad, and the Deccan, where regional governors leveraged military strength, taxation, and diplomacy to govern with minimal interference from Delhi. By the mid-18th century, the Mughal Empire had transformed from centralized and expansive polity into a symbolic authority with fragmented control. While the emperor in Delhi remained a figurehead representing imperial legitimacy, effective governance had shifted to regional powers, European trading companies, and emerging princely states. This transition reflects both the challenges of sustaining large, multi-ethnic empires and the pressures of external economic and military forces on pre-modern polities. Socially and culturally, the empire continued to evolve despite political fragmentation. Cities such as Delhi, Agra, Lucknow, and Hyderabad remained centers of trade, learning, and cultural production. Mughal art, miniature painting, music, and literature persisted, even as patronage shifted from the central court to regional rulers and wealthy merchants. Persian continued as the language of administration and literary expression, while local vernaculars gained prominence in literature, poetry, and religious texts, reflecting the diverse linguistic and cultural environment of India. The decline of central Mughal authority also fostered opportunities for negotiation and adaptation among religious communities. Sikhism, for example, transformed from a persecuted religious movement into a militarized confederacy under the leadership of Maharaja Ranjit Singh and other regional leaders, establishing autonomous states in Punjab. Hindu kingdoms, Rajput principalities, and Jat confederacies leveraged both military resistance and diplomatic engagement to secure local autonomy. These developments demonstrate the resilience of local political structures and the adaptability of communities in the face of imperial decline. Economically, the subcontinent continued to support vibrant trade networks, both internally and internationally. Ports along the eastern and western coasts facilitated exchange with Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, while inland cities serve as hubs for textile production, artisanal crafts, and agricultural surplus. The European trading companies increasingly capitalized on this economic environment, transitioning from purely commercial actors to political players with the capacity to influence succession, military engagements, and territorial administration. By the late 18th century, the historical trajectory of the Mughal Empire had created a complex mosaic of political, social, and economic forces. The emperor's authority remained a potent symbol of legitimacy, but practical governance had shifted to regional powers, European actors, and emerging local polities. This period set the stage for the eventual establishment of British colonial rule, as the declining Mughal framework provided both opportunities and challenges for imperial expansion by foreign powers. The interactions between indigenous states, European trading companies, and shifting alliances foreshadowed the profound transformations that would reshape the subcontinent in the 19th century. The 18th century in India witnessed an unprecedented transformation as the political and economic vacuum left by the decline of the Mughal Empire created a fertile ground for the expansion of European powers, particularly the British East India Company. Originally established in 1600 as a commercial trading organization with a royal charter from the English crown, the company gradually expanded its influence from coastal trading posts to inland territories, taking advantage of the fragmentation of power among regional states, princely rulers, and a residual Mughal authority. By the mid-1700s, the company had secured strategic settlements at Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. These locations served as both trade hubs and military bastions, enabling the company to project force and protect its commercial interests. The expansion of the company's influence was facilitated by its dual capacity as a trading entity and as a quasi-sovereign power, possessing the authority to raise armies, negotiate treaties, and administer territories. This hybrid nature allowed the British to exploit both economic and political opportunities in a fragmented Indian landscape. One of the first major conflicts that demonstrated the company's growing power was the Battle of Plassey. The battle marked a decisive turning point in Indian history, showcasing how European military technology, political alliances, and strategic manipulation could overwhelm larger indigenous forces. The company, under the leadership of Robert Clive, successfully allied with disaffected local rulers, notably Mir Jafar, to defeat the forces of the ruling Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah. The victory at Plassey allowed the British to gain effective control over Bengal's revenues and administration, marking the beginning of their transition from traders to rulers. The administration of Bengal became a model for subsequent company governance. It involved the collection of land revenue, establishment of law and order, and careful management of local elites to maintain legitimacy. Following Plassey, the company faced both internal and external challenges as it expanded its territorial and political control. The Battle of Buxar further solidified British dominance in northern India. This confrontation involved a coalition of Mughal, Awadh, and Bengal forces opposing the company. The company's victory enabled it to secure the Diwani rights, formal authority to collect revenue, in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This marked a fundamental shift in power. An organization initially focused on trade had become the primary revenue authority in a vast and populous region, fundamentally altering the socio-economic fabric of India. The consolidation of British power also coincided with the continued decline of regional states. In the Deccan, the Maratha Confederacy, despite internal cohesion and military prowess, faced increasing pressure from both European powers and rival regional groups. The Confederacy was organized as a collection of semi-autonomous chiefs, such as the Peshwas, Scindias, Holkars, and Bhosles, each exercising considerable control over their respective territories. This decentralized structure, while militarily flexible, hindered the Confederacy's ability to respond effectively to a coordinated European threat. The company capitalized on this fragmentation through diplomacy, alliances, and military campaigns, gradually subduing Maratha territories and integrating them into the colonial revenue system. In southern India, the expansion of the British was complicated by the presence of competing European powers, particularly the French East India Company. The struggle between the British and French, exemplified in the Carnatic Wars, 1746 to 1763, demonstrated that European conflicts often played out on Indian soil, with local rulers caught between these competing forces. The French, allied at times with regional powers such as Hyder Ali and later Tipu Sultan, sought to assert their influence through trade monopolies and military alliances. The British, however, proved more adept at leveraging internal divisions and superior logistics, eventually establishing political predominance in southern India. Resistance to British expansion was persistent and multifaceted. Indigenous rulers, religious leaders, and peasant movements all contributed to the complex socio-political landscape. Tipu Sultan, known as the Tiger of Mysore, exemplified the most organized opposition in southern India. He pursued military modernization, forged alliances with the French, and introduced administrative reforms aimed at strengthening Mysore as a sovereign state. Despite his efforts, Tipu Sultan ultimately fell to combine British and Allied forces in 1799, signaling the near-complete subjugation of southern India under company authority. The British also faced resistance from the north and east. In Bengal and Bihar, local elites, zamindars, merchant groups, and rural communities initially tolerated the company's authority but increasingly resented its revenue demands. The introduction of the Permanent Settlement of 1793, under the guidance of Lord Cornwallis, institutionalized the zamindari system, fixing land revenues and recognizing hereditary rights of landlords. While designed to stabilize revenue collection and co-opt local elites, this system often led to the dispossession of peasants, increased economic inequality, and periodic uprisings, foreshadowing later movements against colonial taxation. Simultaneously, the company expanded its administrative, military, and infrastructural capacity. It established civil services, legal codes, and military divisions modeled on European practices, but adapted to Indian conditions. The use of sepoys, locally recruited soldiers trained and organized by British officers, became central to maintaining order and projecting power. The military organization allowed the company to suppress revolts, defend against external threats, and negotiate from a position of strength with regional rulers. However, reliance on sepoy forces also created vulnerabilities, as demonstrated later in the 1857 revolt, when local soldiers challenged British authority in a widespread uprising. Economically, the British introduced policies that transformed Indian production and trade. While traditional industries, such as textiles, continued to flourish, the company increasingly oriented production toward the export market. Bengal's famous muslin and silk industries, for instance, were gradually reoriented to supply raw materials for European manufacturing centers. The integration of India into a global capitalist economy created both opportunities and challenges. Urban centers grew as trade hubs, while rural regions faced pressures from new forms of taxation, land tenure reform, and commercial agriculture. These changes laid the foundations for a colonial economy that prioritized resource extraction and export-oriented production. Culturally, the period saw significant shifts as well. European education, legal systems, and missionary activity began influencing Indian society. The company's administration encouraged the study of European languages, sciences, and law, creating a class of educated intermediaries who could bridge indigenous and colonial worlds. At the same time, traditional Indian institutions, religious schools, guilds, and artisan networks adapted to changing circumstances, preserving local knowledge and cultural practices while negotiating the demands of colonial authority. The interaction between indigenous and European cultures set the stage for later social reform movements and intellectual debates in the 19th century. Religious and social dynamics during this period were complex. The British initially adopted a policy of minimal interference in local customs and religious practice, recognizing the diversity of Indian society. However, over time, the expansion of missionary activity, legal interventions, and social reform initiatives began to provoke both interest and resistance. Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and tribal communities navigated these changes in diverse ways, negotiating loyalty, resistance, and adaptation to new forms of authority. The ability of communities to mobilize around local, regional, or religious identities contributed to a vibrant, contested social landscape that influenced subsequent political developments. The transition from Mughal to British dominance was thus neither instantaneous nor uniform. Regional powers such as Awadh, Hyderabad, and the Marathas continued to exercise considerable autonomy, often negotiating treaties that allowed limited sovereignty in exchange for allegiance and tribute. At the same time, the British steadily extended administrative, military, and economic control, creating a patchwork of direct and indirect rule that reflected both strategic necessity and pragmatic adaptation. By the end of the 18th century, the company had emerged as the preeminent power on the subcontinent, laying the groundwork for the formal colonial structure that would dominate India in the 19th century. In sum, the rise of British dominance was a multifaceted process driven by political acumen, military strength, economic strategy, and opportunistic alliances. The decline of the Mughal Empire, the fragmentation of regional powers, and the dynamism of local resistance created a complex environment in which a European trading company could transform into a territorial power. This period reshaped Indian society, economy, and governance, producing a legacy of structural change that influenced both the colonial period and the subcontinent's post-colonial trajectory. The 19th century marked the consolidation of British authority across the Indian subcontinent, a period during which the British East India Company transitioned fully into a colonial administrative power, later replaced by the British Crown after 1858. The century witnessed sweeping political, social, economic, and cultural transformations that reshaped India, simultaneously generating conditions for organized resistance and the rise of modern nationalist movements. After the decisive victories in Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and the south against Mysore and the Marathas, the British turned to consolidating control over the remaining princely states and integrating them into a coherent administrative framework. The company employed a mix of direct and indirect rule. Major provinces such as Bengal, Bombay, and Madras were governed directly through company-appointed officials who oversaw revenue collection, judicial administration, and law enforcement. In contrast, semi-autonomous princely states, including Hyderabad, Mysore, and Baroda, were allowed nominal internal sovereignty but were subjected to British oversight via resident officials who controlled foreign relations, military affairs, and succession issues. This dual system of administration created a mosaic of governance that allowed British authority to penetrate Indian society while avoiding the full costs of direct administration over all regions. The early 19th century also saw extensive reforms in land revenue systems, designed to maximize fiscal extraction and stabilize governance. The permanent settlement in Bengal, the Rayatwari system in Madras and Bombay, and the Maholwari system in the northwestern provinces exemplified different approaches tailored to local conditions. Each system involved negotiating relationships with intermediaries, zamindars, ryots, or village collectives to facilitate efficient revenue collection. However, these policies often had destabilizing effects. Peasant indebtedness increased, traditional agricultural practices were disrupted, and social hierarchies were reinforced or altered. In many regions, these economic pressures contributed to localized resistance movements, which, although suppressed, revealed underlying tensions in colonial rule. The British also undertook substantial military and infrastructural consolidation. The Indian Army was reorganized to include large contingents of locally recruited sepoys under British officers, ensuring loyalty through a combination of pay, pensions, and social incentives. Railways, telegraphs, and roads were constructed, not only to facilitate trade and administrative efficiency, but also to allow rapid military deployment across the vast subcontinent. Rail lines, such as the Grand Trunk Railway and telegraph networks, connected previously isolated regions, integrating India into a single colonial infrastructure network. Ports such as Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras became hubs for both domestic distribution and international trade, consolidating British economic dominance. However, the imposition of foreign authority and economic transformation was not uncontested. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, often referred to in Britain as the Sepoy Mutiny, represented the most significant challenge to British rule in the 19th century. Triggered by grievances among sepoys, including the introduction of cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to Hindu and Muslim soldiers alike. The uprising quickly spread to towns and cities across northern and central India. Key centers of resistance included Delhi, where rebels proclaimed the restoration of the Mughal emperor, and Kanpur, which witnessed brutal sieges and massacres. The rebellion drew together diverse social groups, including sepoys, peasants, and local elites, who opposed both military and economic encroachments. Despite the initial successes, the uprising was ultimately suppressed by the better equipped and organized British forces, often with the aid of loyal princely states. The rebellion's failure led to fundamental changes. The company was dissolved, and the British Crown assumed direct control, ushering in the era of the British Raj in 1858. The Raj introduced a more formalized bureaucratic system. Lord Canning oversaw the transition, establishing institutions for civil governance, law, and public works. The Indian Civil Service, ICS, was expanded, primarily staffed by British officials, although a small number of Indians were gradually admitted after competitive examinations were instituted. British legal codes replaced many customary laws, standardizing procedures but often privileging colonial interests over local traditions. Education policy, particularly after the Wood's Dispatch, emphasized Western-style schooling in English, science, and administration, creating an emergent class of educated Indians who would later become the backbone of political and social reform movements. Economically, India was increasingly integrated into the global capitalist economy, supplying raw materials such as cotton, indigo, tea, and jute while importing manufactured goods from Britain. The destruction of traditional industries, especially textile production in Bengal, and the restructuring of agriculture to favor cash crops led to social dislocation, periodic famines, and rural impoverishment. Infrastructure development, while facilitating colonial control, also enabled migration, urbanization, and commercial expansion, creating a dynamic but unevenly distributed economic growth. Socially and culturally, the 19th century witnessed the rise of reform movements that negotiated between indigenous traditions and Western ideas. Leaders such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy advocated for the abolition of practices such as sati and child marriage, while promoting education and rationalist thinking. Similarly, movements for religious revival and reinterpretation, such as those led by Swami Vivekananda, sought to reconcile spirituality with modernity. These reforms often intersected with the colonial project. While the British tolerated or encouraged reform to legitimize their rule, indigenous movements maintained their own intellectual and moral authority, sometimes critiquing colonial interference. By the late 19th century, political consciousness began to coalesce into organized movements. The formation of the Indian National Congress in 1885 marked a turning point. Initially composed of educated elites seeking administrative participation and moderate reform, the Congress gradually expanded its base and agenda, advocating for civil rights, representation, and eventually self-rule. At the same time, regional and religious movements emerged, addressing grievances specific to communities, language groups, and economic classes. The proliferation of newspapers, pamphlets, and public meetings facilitated political debate, creating a nascent civil society that transcended local boundaries. The early 20th century saw intensified resistance to British policies, particularly after the introduction of discriminatory taxes, land laws, and the partition of Bengal, which was widely perceived as an attempt to divide and weaken nationalist sentiment. The partition provoked widespread protest, including boycotts, strikes, and the Swadeshi movement, which encouraged the use of locally produced goods. Leaders such as Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, and Bipin Chandra Pal championed assertive political action, laying the groundwork for the mass movements that would dominate the struggle for independence. The impact of World War I further transformed Indian society and politics. Indian soldiers were recruited in large numbers to support the British war effort, and the economic strains of the war fueled inflation, unemployment, and social unrest. Although India contributed significantly to the Allied victory, post-war promises of political reform were only partially realized. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms introduced limited self-governing institutions at provincial levels, but the reforms were widely seen as inadequate, catalyzing a more radical nationalist response. Leaders such as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi returned to India from South Africa, bringing strategies of nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, and mass mobilization that would redefine the struggle for independence. The interwar years saw a dramatic expansion of nationalist activity, including campaigns such as the Non-Cooperation Movement, 1920 to 1922, the Civil Disobedience Movement, 1930 to 1934, and the Quit India Movement, 1942. These movements involved millions of Indians from diverse regions, religions, and social classes. They challenged British authority through strikes, boycotts, protests, and the refusal to comply with colonial laws, demonstrating that political power could no longer be monopolized by a distant administration. Economic hardships, exacerbated by the Great Depression, and communal tensions heightened the urgency for self-rule, highlighting the limitations of colonial governance and the contradictions inherent in the imperial system. Simultaneously, the British introduced reforms in governance and education in response to nationalist pressures, attempting to co-opt moderates and stabilize their authority. The Government of India Act 1935 expanded provincial autonomy, restructured representation, and attempted to create a federal system. Although these measures were insufficient to satisfy nationalist aspirations, they reflected the growing acknowledgement that India's political future could not be indefinitely postponed. Indigenous political institutions, regional parties, and social organizations became central actors in the negotiations that would eventually lead to independence. The culmination of these centuries-long transformations occurred in the aftermath of World War II. India's economic contribution to the Allied war effort, combined with the decline of British global power and mounting nationalist pressure, made the continuation of direct colonial rule untenable. In 1947, India achieved independence, resulting in the creation of two sovereign states, the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan. The end of British rule marked the closure of a long historical arc that had begun with trade, evolved into territorial control, and culminated in complex socio-political transformation across the subcontinent. The journey from fragmented regional powers to a unified colonial administration and ultimately to independence had profound consequences. The colonial period had restructured political authority, economy, society, and culture. It introduced new systems of governance, law, and education, and integrated India into a global economy. It also generated resistance, intellectual ferment, and the emergence of modern political consciousness. Independence represented both the fulfillment of nationalist aspirations and the beginning of a new historical trajectory in which India and its people could redefine their identity, governance, and place in the world. Thus, the history of India from the post-Mughal fragmentation, the rise of the British East India Company, consolidation under the British Crown, socio-economic restructuring, and nationalist mobilization culminates in the profound achievement of sovereignty. The narrative reflects resilience, adaptation, and agency, illustrating how diverse peoples navigated imperial pressures, maintained cultural and social continuity, and ultimately shaped their destiny. The subcontinent's transformation across these centuries serves as a testament to the interplay of local initiative, foreign intervention, and the inexorable drive towards self-determination.